Hello, everyone. So, in Intro to Visual Arts today, we're going to be talking about Chapter 19, the 18th and 19th centuries. There's two parts. This is the first part, Part 1. We're talking about the 18th century, and we're talking about the art movements of Rococo, Romanticism, and Neoclassical. So we'll talk about that today. Just a few reminders before we start, though. There is on Wednesday, April 15th, your hands-on projects are due. So all those ones that you've done, like the drawing, the print, the painting, the photo series, you will upload those to the media album that's listed under the hands-on projects folder. So look for that, have those uploaded. And then this Friday, the themes of art response is due. So remember, we've done one of those before. That's where you take one of the chapters that's in the theme of art response section and select one of them, or even just a subcategory like gender or power or religion, and then pick an artwork that's anywhere in the book. It doesn't necessarily have to be one that we discussed that's not in that chapter, and relate your viewpoint based on the ideas that were presented in that chapter. So today we're going to be talking about the 18th century. And we start in France in the era of absolutism. This is when the French king, the monarchy, was sort of all powerful, and he had the authority, the sole authority to dictate the affairs of the state. He was famous for saying two things. One of the things he christened himself the Sun King. So, thinking about the empire of France and the French king, and everything sort of starts and ends with him, like the setting and the rising of the sun. So that was his nickname, the Sun King. The other thing that he's really famous for saying is, "I am the state." So not just he is the king, but he is France. He is the monarch that's in absolute control. So things that get decided, his health, his wealth, reflects France in general. So it's a really interesting symbolism. We start with this as an example of what's happening in the beginning of the 18th century, and you can see that the art that's made during this time and after in the 19th century is very much a reaction to Louis the 14th being the Sun King and that sort of absolute power, and actually the corruption that can happen because of tyranny and because of the king. So it wasn't necessarily all of the things that he did, but some of the power that he held, and some of his descendants who were not as interested in, say, ruling the country as much as just like enjoying their own wealth, which led to the French Revolution, of course. So this is Rigaud's painting of Louis the 14th, King of France. And what do you notice about this? Look around, look at the image here. It's sort of his power and his wealth and his status on full display. Look at the fabric. Look at the way the fabric's rendered. Look at the architecture. Look at the setting that he's in. This is a very powerful man, and that he's in a very powerful place here. You can see the fleur-de-lis here, the French symbol, the flower here on his robe, and his matching chair. He's coordinating. That's so cute. And his crown here, his staff, his sword. Even though he probably doesn't use it, it's much more decorative. It's encrusted with jewels. And then he's kind of flinging his robe to the side so you can see his legs and how cut and beautiful these legs are. He's got a nice set of legs. He wants to show them off with his tights and his platform shoes. He's wearing high heel shoes that he designed himself because he was 5'4", very short in stature, but he wanted to look taller and more powerful. Even the pose is dramatic, and it's this really sort of awkward stance. Like if you were to kind of stand in this pose, it's not really very comfortable, or what you would seem very natural, right? It's kind of a forced pose. So a lot of times what I want students to think about when they're looking at art, and specifically looking at a portrait, nothing is incidental, right? Nothing is an accident. Everything is very posed, right? So everything, including the fabric in the background, the fact that there's a column back here, which you think about as like power and strength and solidity, right, is a connection, a symbolism to Louis the 14th and his power. But I want you to think about, like, in terms of a portrait, who do you think had more of a say in showing Louis the 14th and how he looked? Himself or the artist, right? It was probably a collaboration, but who do you think had the final say in what this looked like? Or who do you think fashioned, even though this is a painting by Rigaud, who fashioned the way that he looks, his stance, his pose, right? I would consider this much more self-fashioning, right? That Louis XIV is wanting to get a particular feeling across, evoked and power and mood by this pose. So this is a really large painting. It's larger than life. It's 6 foot by 9 foot, really large in status. And this would have been something that would have been displayed in the king's palace, right? If you've heard of Versailles before, this was Louis XIV just, built Versailles and made it, and there's even this hall of mirrors, there's gold everywhere. He was said to have spent like millions on decorating this with gold, but also, just a way of showing off. So if people came, if dignitaries from other places came, or if he's making a deal, a treaty, he wants to show off that he has all of this wealth and power. And you can see that as well in this painting that would have been in Versailles. So if you think about how art gets made, who has the power, who has the ability to get made, this would have come out of, Rigaud's portrait of Louis XIV would have been sanctioned by him. Rigaud would have worked for Louis XIV. So you had an official sanctioning of artwork that could be made. So you had the government that would create the situation where artists could study, become artists, and then show their work. We call this the Academy, also known as the Salon, which we'll talk much more about throughout this chapter and the next couple of chapters as well. So in that Salon or Academy, or the official French official supported artwork, you had kind of different camps. You had camps, and this is earlier art. This is art that's from the Baroque period that we looked at in the last chapter, but it influences Rococo in this chapter. So you had 2 camps that were working with the French king and part of the official French Academy. And those were followers of Poussin, who you see on the left here. They called themselves Poussinates. Or you had the followers of Rubens, who was this Dutch Baroque artist, and they were called the Rubenistas. And the Poussin followers on the left here were, because he was much more interested in clarity, in line, and really horizontal type compositions, everything kind of in its place and orderly. So the followers, and you could see this kind of style here in Rigaud's work as well. Followers of Rubens, though, which kind of turns into Rococo, this first kind of really big influential movement in the modern era, were followers of Rubens, and Rubens was much more interested in color and exuberance, energy, dynamic angles, which was kind of typical of Baroque, like if you think about artists like Caravaggio. So here we would see on the left much more crisp definition, line, non-emphasis on color, and on the right, Rubens, color, more dynamic angles, curvilinear, and really fleshy figures. Actually, if you think about the term Rubenesque, it actually comes from the artist Peter Paul Rubens, because a lot of his figures were really, really plump and fleshy. So this was a very important painting. This was the cycle of paintings of the Medici, who was marrying one of the kings, the French king. So you can see this image. Page 475. So she is marrying Louis XV, the successor of Louis XIV. And you can see in the painting a lot of emphasis on sort of like the fabric, the folds, the shading, and a very beautiful sense of composition, really large. These paintings are all in the Louvre. It's a cycle of 21 different paintings that tell the story of Marie de Medici, who was this woman who came from Italy to marry the French king. And here you see her getting off of the boat, landing in France. And so this kind of like mythical scene with a historical scene. So Rococo is the art of the time period right after Louis the XIV, and it's all about work that is very extravagant. You had these salons. Salons were gatherings held by the aristocrats. They were generally held by women that had this sort of, just leisure time. They had time to talk about art, talk about music, play concerts, entertain each other, and gossip, and also talk about artwork. So art music were very prominent in those. There would be little small concerts, gathering, people would gossip, talk about sex, talk about music, talk about art. And Rococo art becomes really characterized by this movement of salons and leisure and the pursuit of leisure. So in Rococo, first of all, that term comes from the word meaning small broken shells and stones, because in France at the time, there were these grottos or artificial caves that were decorated with these stones and these broken shells. So the word Rococo comes to define the artwork as being very decorative. So the art is more style versus substance, if that makes sense. So some of the themes that you see in Rococo is fashion, leisure, or the pursuit of leisure, love and love making, and a lot of pastel colors. So an example of this is Fragonard, and you can see here he was much more influenced by Rubens, right? He's a follower of Rubens. He considered himself a Rubenista. So Fragonard in this bather scene is showing kind of the pursuit of leisure and love and very verdant greens, lush kind of landscape, but pastels. There's pinks, there's oranges, there's greens and blues, very pastel-oriented colors. This is a much more famous image by Fragonard. So he worked for the French king as well, worked as part of the court, and you can see as officially a member of the Academy and the Salon as sort of like this government-sanctioned art. He was really influential in the development of this sort of exuberant style called Rococo. And you can see the pastels, you see pinks, turquoise, blues, greens. But what's going on in this image? First of all, it's called The Swing, so we know it's about this woman swinging in this, again, kind of lush garden, which is a metaphor for love, right? Blossoming love in a garden, very thick. But there's two male figures. So you see mostly she is the emphasis, she's the focal point. Really stands out because there's a lot of blues and greens, and her warm colors, pastels, are contrasting those cool colors in the background. You can see she's flirtatiously kicking off her shoe here. You've got this guy over here who's actually just like a garden nymph, a statue, but he's sort of coming to life and he's saying, shh, like your secret is safe with me, right? Well, this is her partner here. This is her husband, this older gentleman, who's pushing her on the swing. And out of his view, but in her view, is her lover. So she has her husband, but she also has her lover over here who she's flirting with, and she's kicking off that slipper, and he can see up her skirt, right? So this really interesting scene about love, lovemaking, leisure, flirtation, pastels, and this is just quintessential Rococo. Just a very beautiful example of Rococo. So Fragonard, and then a really interesting character in the whole scheme of things, Rococo, kind of bridging the gaps, honestly, between Rococo and what we'll talk about with neoclassical art, because she actually works past the French Revolution. So it's interesting, pre-French Revolution, what her work looks like, and then post-French Revolution. Oftentimes, you kind of think about the pendulum swinging, the power of one king like Louis XIV, his descendants, Louis XV, and then you have the French Revolution, right? Which is like against the monarchy, And then you have Napoleon. But after Napoleon, the pendulum swings back, and actually descendants of Louis XIV rise back to power as elected leaders. So it's really interesting if you think about power and how art reflects the power structures and the paradigms politically. So this is Marie Vigy Lebrun, and she was an official painter of the court. And here you can see she's painting a duchess. But you can see that court style, which we notice here. This is kind of pre-Rococo with the Rigaud portrait of Louis XIV. And you see that as well here, but you also see an element of Rococo in her work as well. So she was really important, and I think, you know, we might take it for granted today that this idea that women can you know, have their say politically and in terms of power. But you know, at the time, it would have been very rare to be a female artist, and not only to be a female artist, but to be able to make political statements and to have some of the you know, not just the popularity or to reflect what was going on in society, but to also be a tastemaker, to be a trendsetter, to kind of set the tone of what other artists would do. So Vigy Lebrun was very influential in that, a very interesting painter. Just a blip on the radar in this chapter, but it's one worth noting that she was very influential and helpful for artists that came after her. So here is, and the book doesn't show this one, they just have the Duchess painting, but she was the official court painter of Marie Antoinette, right? The famous Marie Antoinette, who is said to have said, "Let them eat cake." It's believed now that she likely did not say that, but the Austrian, you know, Duchess that became a queen was later guillotined. Her work was, you know, she wasn't really popular, but she was all about fashion and beauty. There's a beautiful movie, Marie Antoinette. Kirsten Dunst stars in it over here. And you can see this is the official court painter, Vigy Lebrun, painting Marie Antoinette. So after this, kind of a reaction, both politically and artistically, neoclassicism is a response, a direct response to Rococo. Rococo gets seen as being just sort of like frivolous and lavish and more about, you know, things that are not as sincere. So neoclassical is this time period. France helped discover and excavate Pompeii in Rome, the ancient ruins where Mount Vesuvius had erupted and, you know, trapped this first century city under all of that volcanic ash. It was basically frozen in time. So once they excavated that in the 18th century, they were able to see what it was actually like in ancient Rome. And so neoclassical was a way of people starting to look at Roman and Greek art again. So they didn't like the way that the Renaissance treated it. So now they were trying to imbue it, those compositions and subject matter, more with virtue. Right? So we see that in works like this. Another female artist that's very important, this is a British artist, Angelica Kauffman. And what's really interesting about her work as well is, so she studied part in France, so she's part of the French art movement, but also brings it back to England. And here she's depicting an ancient myth. Here she's depicting, you know, this idea of looking back at a Greek, a Roman myth and a Roman history to be instructive, not just as kind of like, this is the story of what happened in Rome, you know, 1,000 so years ago, but rather, how is this instructive to us today? How can we glean a lesson for this? So this is this water nymph, Egeria, advising Numa in the second king of Rome. And this is this Ovidian myth associated with her by saying that she is counseling him. See how she's pointing up and she's saying, she's reminding him of a higher power, of a higher peace, a gesture that basically, you know, is saying like, okay, we have our ideas here, but there's also some greater virtues and some greater truths that we should be attaining to, not just our own whims. So we could see this as being instructive at the time period. So, you know, I was mentioning how Angelica Kauffman, as a British artist, is really important because just like there was the French Salon and the French Academy, there was also in England a British Academy as well, the official academy. And Angelica Kauffman was one of the founders, one of two people to found the official state Royal Academy in England. What's interesting about that is, as a female artist, she was one of only two women that were actually accepted into the British Academy, and that was the case for over 100 years. So she was very influential, very early sort of prototypical feminist, and her work is not just about women, but it really explores the power of women and their place in society, not just as mothers, but she showed them in a positive light as mothers, which would have been atypical at the time, but also in how they can influence politics, which we see here in this image. So neoclassical, what is it? Well, one of those ideas was, like I mentioned before, it's like classical power structure, and that the people are important. So this emphasis on man, emphasis on sort of the common man as well in terms of neoclassical. So bravery, heroicism, we see that that anyone can look at these images and identify and see themselves in the work. You could see yourself in this work. You could see yourself in this work. So this is a very famous painting by Jacques-Louis David, the famous neoclassical artist. And this is Marat, who was actually a martyr. He was a fallen hero of the revolution. So if you think about the French Revolution, Marat was one who was against the power solely being connected to the king or the monarchy, because we could see with someone like Louis XIV, later with Louis XV, that power can corrupt. And that instead they were looking for a representative style of government, the average man, right? And so you see that idealized in this painting with a neoclassical sort of style. And if anyone watched Wasteland as their film, you'll remember that this was part of the film where Vic Muniz poses Tio as the death of Marat, this painting. Marat was this revolutionary. He was martyred. He was tricked by a woman who was a follower of the monarch. She was a monarchist. She sympathized with the king and didn't want to see him toppled. And so she wrote Marat a letter, which you can see here, to gain entry. He's writing a response letter, and you can see he's in his bathtub. Marat was actually this real person, so he had this, the book doesn't tell what this, but he had a skin condition. It was very painful. He would have these like kind of little scales or like hives that he would get on his body, and they would be really itchy. So his only relief was to be in a bathtub. So as people would come visit him, oftentimes he would be in the bathtub. So she gained entry and she kills him. So you can see the knife that she used to kill him here, and he's holding his pen, and he's in a pose that's very typical to the deposition of Christ, where Christ coming off of the cross or Christ being buried in a tomb. So Marat is this really religious icon almost. As a martyr, he died for the cause. And this actually helped people. This writing desk here doubles almost as a tomb, and you can see it says "To Marat" by David. Jacques-Louis David painted this. Jacques-Louis David was also a revolutionist. He was part of the French Revolution, and so he was a sympathizer with Marat. So this was sort of a call to arms, and it really inspired people to get on one side or the other, essentially. The book doesn't show this, but this is a very famous image by Jacques-Louis David. And you can see here very classical, imagery, Roman and Greek mythology, and you can see the sense of power and heroicism that's here. A longer story about this, but just boiled down, basically these brothers here are vowing to fight, even though it means they may widow their wives who are grieving over here. So it's sort of like the power of the republic over my individual. I'm looking out for the interest of the state, or in this case, even though it's talking about Rome, it's really talking about modern day France. It's saying, if you're thinking about the revolution, this idea of freedom and representative government is more important than just me and my own individual pursuits. Neoclassical also manifests itself in architecture. Thomas Jefferson on the left here designed his own home, Monticello. He also designed the campus at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And you can see on the right, he designed the state capitol in Richmond, Virginia. It's the reason that most of the architecture in DC is very classical looking is because of Thomas Jefferson. So at the same time you have the French Revolution, you also have the American Revolution, and they could have made their architecture look like anything. At the time, this wasn't necessarily popular architectural. Federalism was more popular. I mean, there was just, you could have modeled yourself after anything. It's a brand new empire in a sense. They're distancing themselves from the British. But here they choose Roman and Greek temples to show the power of the American government and the freedom and idealism of representative government, which was an idea that comes from the Greek, right? Politics, polis, city-state, meaning representative government. So it's really interesting, and this still exists today. One of the other artists from the neoclassical period is Ingres, but Ingres shows us in a way a connection to mannerism. Remember towards the end of Michelangelo's life, like The Last Judgment, and other artists like El Greco, they stretched out the figures. Well, this is a very beautiful painting. It looks very representational, but one of the things is people that noticed at the time, and this was in the official salon, this was a painting that got accepted into this. You basically, you didn't just have art exhibitions or galleries. There was only one exhibition, and it was the salon, and you were either in or you were out. So this was a picture that was included in the salon. Very large painting. So this is about 3 foot by 6 foot. And people that saw it at the time, the complaint was like, well, wait a minute, that back is like impossibly long. And if you study anatomy at all, you notice like this spine just seems to keep going forever, like from here to here. Look how long her arms appear to be, and you know, her hips are way down here. So there's this kind of like, otherworldly quality to it. Well, that was intentional because Grand Odalisque, even though, you know, this was something that would have been common for a Parisian or someone in Paris to think about, a woman in a brothel, right, a prostitute. This was meant to be exotic, so this was more meant to look like someone from the Middle East, even though Ingres doesn't quite get it right because she's white as all get out. She looks like a Parisianer. Here she's wearing a turban, not as a kind of fashion statement, but to represent how people dressed in the Middle East. This is sort of like this Turkish bath scene. You can see this peacock fan that she's holding. Here's a hookah that she would smoke, or her John would partake in. So there's a really interesting connection between exotic tastes. And this kind of leads into what we'll talk about in the second part, next lecture, moving into realism. So the next movement that we talk about is Romanticism. And Romanticism is more about the function of the individual's point of view, but also nature and our place, sort of like, you know, this is after the, Enlightenment. So you have these dualities of like reason, but then also kind of just like beauty and philosophy and your own personal kind of reflection. So both of those, like science, but also like individual, just like reflection. Romanticism is more about introspective, versus like, something that has to agree by a certain kind of style, which is interesting. It's more about individualism. But it also uses some of these ideas from the Enlightenment and also the Industrial Revolution. So Romanticism, during the Romantic period, you can think of poets like William Wordsworth and John Keats, and we also see manifestations of Romanticism, not always romantic. A lot of times people think, oh, Romanticism, it's all about love, it's all about romance. No, it's more of individuality, and sometimes how nature can be horrific, so not always ideal. First, this is the very influential British artist John Constable. I had an opportunity last summer to study British art at Yale, and I saw a lot of Constable's work. This one's actually in the National Gallery in London, but a very famous painting. And he's this sort of interesting bridge between artists that are more interested in realism, and then later what we'll see at the end of the chapter, like Impressionism. So John Constable would make these studies out actually in nature. He was part of the British Salon, which I talked about, Angelica Kauffman helped form, and Sir Joshua Reynolds was the other person that formed. It was the founder of the British Royal Academy. But John Constable did something that was not popular. He painted landscapes. At the time, like history painting and portraits were really popular and seen as a better, more higher art. And here he's painting a landscape, but in a way he's painting a history painting. Because if you think about it, the Industrial Revolution is in full swing right now. So that really influences these artists to go out and paint the landscape. And John Constable was one of the first really to do this. He was inspired by Claude Lorraine. Remember I showed you Lorraine's work and the picturesque in the last chapter. So what he wanted to show was sort of this lifestyle that was dying. John Constable grew up on a farm, and he grew up in this sort of rural setting. And so this would have been something that would have been known to him, but when you live in London, it's an industrial city. There's smokestacks. There's a lot of, people are starting to work, evening shifts too, with the, advent of gas lighting. So people are kind of doing things that in a way are unnatural, right? They're living close together. It's dirty in the city. It's dark. It's grimy. And here he wants to show a simpler way of life. The hay wain. This was a farmer who lived in this house for over 80 years. The book mentions he spent his entire life there. He was only away from his house for 4 nights. So in a way, this is like this really turbulent landscape that's changing and is this potential threat here with this clouds coming in, almost look like darker in one spot where a storm might be brewing. And in a way, Constable is saying, like, the landscape is changing, nature can change, but this here is stability in this overall scene of uncertainty and permanence, contrasting with this idea of change. And what part are we going to be in? This river is constantly flowing. What part are we going to find ourselves in? Are we going to get swept up in this kind of new lifestyle in a city, or are we going to be able to return perhaps to a simpler way of life? I had the opportunity, like I mentioned, in Yale to see more of Constable's work. What was cool about his work is he would actually go out into the landscape, which was unheard of at the time. Most people that were painting the landscape at that time would just invent their landscapes and just be like, that looks like a sky. But Constable would go out there and make these small sketches. And you can see how clouds and skies are very important to him, John Constable. And so he did these studies, and these were never meant to be exhibited. But for him, they were personal sketches. And he'd probably be turning in his grave today if he knew they were actually exhibited in a museum. This is at the Yale Center. I took these pictures. I just want to show you, he was carefully studying this. So he was really interested in terms of, if you think about romanticism and like the subject matter and being more free, emotional, but it's also reliant on nature and science. And what's interesting about these studies, if you flip them over on the back, he would very carefully notate the weather, the time of day, and what type of cloud this was, whether it was like a stratus cloud or a nimbus cloud. Those names were brand new, just discovered and kind of named by one of John Constable's friends. It's a really interesting connection between science and art here. So he's carefully studying these so that he can later put them in these really, really large, massive paintings. This painting is 5 foot by 6 foot, and it's usually that scale. Landscapes were smaller. That scale of painting was saved for a really important portrait of like a king or a historical scene. So it's really interesting that he's making landscape like a historical painting. Another romanticism artist, a romantic artist, is Turner. So Constable and Turner were at the same time period, and they were sort of like rivals. Constable was very well known throughout his career. He was part of the establishment. Turner, throughout his career sold a lot of paintings, was very famous, but towards the end people thought he went mad and his paintings became more and more abstract. So they become more about nature. And if we think about the power of the individual, on this scale they're much smaller. The book shows a different image, but I want to show this painting. I think it's a really important work by Turner, probably his best known painting, but it's called The Slave Ship. And at first you just see, it looks like an abstract painting. You see a bit of the sunset in the background, you see waves. But the more you look, the closer you inspect it and dissect this painting, the more starts to unravel in front of you. And you notice the title is The Slave Ship. Then you see this ship as having this more derogatory meaning or symbolism as being a slave ship. Well, and as the story goes, in the 1840s in England, slavery was banned. It was not yet banned in the United States. So this is a sort of cautionary moral tale, like this idea of slavery was something that we were all wrapped up in, and people in England believed in it and followed it, but now it's banned and we're kind of seeing it as amoral. What other things are we doing and agreeing to and following suit because the king tells us to do them? And maybe they're amoral as well. He waited until this was, becoming a prevalent view in England, not yet in the United States, that slavery is an abomination. It's very amoral, right? So what we see here is this story of a slaver who had taken slaves back from the Ivory Coast in Africa, and he was going to take them to England in the slave trade. And actually in the 1840s, even though it was banned and it was illegal, there was still some practices of slavery, of trading slaves, that was still an enslaved people that was still practiced. So the story goes that during this time, there was this one slave ship that some of the enslaved people on the ship who were going to be sold became sick, became ill, and the slaver threw them overboard because they were worth more as insurance money than if they would have died on the boat or brought them back really, really ill. So it's just a horrific tale. And to see these people as commodities, as something that you own, as opposed to humans, as opposed to basically, part of your larger family in terms of brothers and sisters and the whole world. So Turner is saying, look at where we come from. And it's hard to see in here, but if you look close, there's birds flying. Look at this nasty fish over here. There's all these sharks and fish that are eating this leg that is still in shackles here, and we can see some other shackles here, hands reaching out, lots of different enslaved people that have been thrown overboard. This painting is in Boston. I had the opportunity to see it this past summer, and you can see, and I show you this because you get the sense of scale, and also there's a lot of detail that you will never see. Like here, I'm showing a cropped view of it closer up. You can see some more of the hands, the fish that are reaching out. This is supposed to be a shark. I don't think Turner probably ever saw a shark. But you miss that detail unless you see it in person. Another romantic artist is Caspar David Friedrich. He's one of my favorite artists of this time period. He is a German artist, so he's more interested in showing what was very typical of German nationality. What do we have that's unique that other areas and regions don't? And this is a famous painting of his called Monk by the Sea. So it's this religious person, it's this cleric, kind of being introspective and thinking about nature and thinking about contemplating themselves in the larger scheme of things. This is based on an earlier concept that Edmund Burke, a philosopher, coined this term, the sublime, where nature inspires awe and terror, and we kind of think about ourselves in the grander scheme of things. We could definitely see this painting by Turner as an example of the sublime, because nature's force, when it's wielded in all of its power and might, is more powerful than us as individuals. And if you think about, these people being turned over, these enslaved people turned over to nature, who's going to win, right? Nature's going to win. Even this impending storm here might topple over the ship. Nature's going to win. That's the idea of the sublime, right? And so the monk is being introspective. He's thinking about the landscape. And this was a very common pose. There's another one that's very famous that you've probably seen before. Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, where it's this guy dressed in really fancy clothes. We just see him from behind. He's on the top of the rocks, looking over this panoramic vista of this beautiful landscape. And it's sort of like nature can inspire us, but it can also scare the shit out of us, right? That's the sublime. I think the best way to show the sublime is this painting by George Stubbs. The book doesn't mention it, but it shows nature's force. Sublime can be seen as terror and beauty all at the same time. So I think this picture by George Stubbs is a much better reflection of what the power of Romanticism and the sublime can really stand to mean. And in close proximity to this painting, you see mostly it's, I mean, 90% of the painting is dedicated to nature. The majority of the painting is dedicated to the landscape, but that 10%, right, is what really speaks volume. It's a lion attacking a horse. And George Stubbs, as the story goes, it's actually a myth, and it didn't really happen, but he told his friends that he painted this lion attacking a horse in many different variations, many different compositions, prints, paintings, drawings. But he said he was going to Africa. He was coming back from Morocco, and he was on a ship and he saw a lion attacking a horse. It's really unrealistic that he would have seen this, but yet it was something that captivated him, and throughout his art career he returned to the same subject matter. So when we see this, it's really a power struggle of good versus evil, of the lion versus the horse, and the horse is white, and if you look close, it's meant to see like this is purity. White as purity is like, but it's being corrupted by this lion and being attacked. And the horse is just like, wow, like, you know, just whinnying or screaming out in pain as the lion just does what a lion does, right? Attacks it, and eats and devours it. And so it's this power struggle, nature, the sublime. And if you look at the horse, it isn't just, you know, sort of like an impressionistic view of a lion or a horse. It's very naturalistic. And George Stubbs, I've done some research on George Stubbs, was very famous for doing a study of the anatomy of horses. And he would take horses as cadavers and carve them up and hang them from his barn to be able to study them, and did this really beautiful illustrations of them so that he could do paintings like this. The last artist that we're going to talk about is Goya. And Goya is an interesting figure because if you're talking about the 18th century and you're starting with you know, Rigaud and his portrait of Louis XIV, very counterpoised to that, on the opposite spectrum of that, is a very opposite side of the kind of political power, and that's Goya's depiction, The 3rd of May. So this was during the Napoleonic Wars. This was during the spread of Napoleon's reign. So you had, after the French king gets, you know, taken out of power, Napoleon fills that power void. At first, the French revolutions were all about Napoleon, the revolutionists. Later, Napoleon came to be seen as just as corrupt as some of the kings. It's kind of like, careful what you ask for, right? And the power pendulum swings back to the monarchy again after that. But it's interesting because Napoleon not only took over France, but he was taking over large areas of Europe, Spain, all the way through Germany, eastern parts of Russia. And so his power was seen as one that he was trying to basically create another Roman Empire. And he stole a lot of art in the process. But when he came through Spain, there was this revolution that was happening there as well. And a lot of people were saying, well, maybe we don't really like the Spanish king. Maybe we should trust Napoleon because he's going to give us freedom. He's going to give us the ability to, you know, more power is going to be placed in the individual as opposed to the state. And these are sympathizers here to the Spanish government that were rebelling against the French government here, and they get caught up. They become martyrs as well. You can see this guy reaching out in this almost Christ-like pose, being martyred like on a cross. You see the church in the background here, but it's dark. It's not hopeful. It isn't like people can trust either the state or the church. They can't trust. They don't know who to trust. They don't know if their neighbors are sympathizers with the Spanish government or the French government. And so as a result, people just are fear-stricken, agony, they're in grief, and they're just being, you know, killed. These people said, if we surrender, we won't take sides. We won't fight for either side. We just want to be neutral, right? And this is their fate. This is what happens to them. You can't. In other words, this painting is saying Goya is being very cynical and saying, in a way, you do have to take sides because you can't be ambivalent. You can't just be, you know, saying like it's going to be okay because the revolution's going to happen whether you're part of it or not. So it's a really interesting painting. Very horrific. He showed the horrors of war in this sort of Spanish Revolution amidst the French Revolution, and we can see later in his life he gets really he actually gets committed to an insane asylum. And later in his, I'm sorry, I misspoke. He becomes mad and he's living at home and he does all these paintings of people that are in an insane asylum, and they're called black paintings. And really interesting how he kind of falls off at the end there. But what he does is influential for artists that come after him as well, because it becomes very individualistic and the character is very unique with the art. So the artist is saying like, my statement is more important than what other movements are happening. So I don't necessarily have to take part in following neoclassical art or romantic art. I can kind of do my own thing. So in a way it's like mannerism. And so that's where we'll pick up at part 2. We'll talk about realism and we'll talk about moving into the 19th century. So reminder, don't forget to upload your images for the hands-on projects, and don't forget the writing of the paper, short paper, really short, about a page long, Themes of Art Respond. So peace out, signing out. Hope everyone stays safe, be well, bye.